Thank you very much for coming, Vivek. Elizabeth, thanks for the intro. And let's get right into it. So Ed Markey said this is the battle of our times, Vivek. How did the Surgeon General of the United States, who's this internal medicine doctor, become such a leader on this topic and also start writing a book about social connections? What got you into this?
Well, it was interesting. If you had told me at the beginning of my time as Surgeon General that I would be focused a lot on emotional health and well-being, on loneliness and social connection, I would have said that that's probably not the case. But I have found myself, deeply immersed in that space because of what I have been taught by people all around the country who, through their conversations about addiction, about mental illness, through their conversations about what they're concerned about regarding their children, have surfaced that emotional well-being, or a lack thereof, is a real challenge, a real crisis in our country right now. And it's manifesting quite often as loneliness and isolation. And the role that technology plays in that is a really important one, because technology can help, it can hurt. The question is, how do we use it best to augment our connection? But that's how I got interested in this larger topic of loneliness. I've been working on this book, as you mentioned, for the last many months. And my wife periodically pokes her head into the little den where I work, right. And she says, Vivek, do you realize how ironic it is that you are all alone writing this book on loneliness?
I was about to ask you that.
Yeah. And writing a book can be a lonely experience at times, but in a very real way. I've had to actually think about how do I cultivate and build a community and social connections during this experience.
So let me ask you a couple questions, because when you use the word addiction, right? So you're a doctor. So I remember talking back to Facebook, actually wrote it in 2011, came out in 2012. And I used the term addiction, because that's what it looks like, that's what it walks like, that's what it talks like. But I remember talking to our colleague Sherry Turkle, whom I'm sure you know well from MIT, who wrote that brilliant book, Alone Together, at the time. And she's like, be careful using the word addiction, be careful. So you're a doctor, you're the Surgeon General, for God's sake. You feel comfortable with the term addiction? Because I do, but I'm a layperson, I'm not a doc. Talk about addiction, and then I want to ask you some of the mental health and loneliness questions. But do you look at it as addiction in the way that the average person would?
Well, I think these tools, and let's be specific what we're talking about, like whether it's social media or the smartphones that we have in our hands,
right.
I think these do have addictive qualities to them. And by that, what I mean is that they can lead people to feel compelled to use them, and sometimes even to the detriment of their function. So one of the key things you look at when you're anyway, so just to say that, because I'm going to give you some examples of this. So number one, many of us have had the experience, for example, of feeling compelled to check our phone, whether it's our inbox or our social media content, even when we have no clear reason to, and even when we know it's detracting from what we're doing in the moment.
I'm sure there will be people here in the audience doing that today.
I have done this, and I'm embarrassed to say that I've actually even done this at times when my children were around, and I feel badly about that. But it's sort of a compulsion that we sometimes feel. Now, when I talk to kids in particular, and to parents of children, they describe it in very sort of similar ways. This compulsion to engage with a platform to check their inbox, their latest comments, etc., even though they know that it doesn't make them feel good afterward, and even though they know it's taking them away from what they actually want to be doing, which is often interacting with people or doing something that's going to actually enhance their mental health and well-being. So to me, that's very concerning. And we get a little bit of gratification, if you will, in the form of a dopamine hit to our brain, whenever we refresh our inbox, whenever we go on social media to see if we've got a new message or if somebody has liked the last thing that we tweeted, etc. And over time, that can be really compelling to us in ways that ultimately end up harming us instead of helping us.
So so your book is it emphasizes the importance of social connections, but your book and your research are looking at sort of how isolated do you think we're more isolated than we were, say, a decade or two ago as a society?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. I think it's really hard to say based on the data whether there has been an increase in isolation. Some people looking at the data believe there's probably been a modest increase. But here's actually what's more interesting to me, is the fact that loneliness levels in our society are markedly higher than what you would think. So even if you look at conservative studies, and by conservative I mean in terms of methodology and such, what you find is that loneliness levels probably hover, around somewhere around 20% when it comes to the adult population of the United States. Wow. That's conservative. There's studies that put it at nearly double that as well. And this is not just a United States, issue. This is not just an American problem. Right. But Australia actually has revealed through some of its research that around 25% of their adults were struggling with loneliness. Similar figures in the UK, China, Japan, India, many other countries across the world, including Denmark, Netherlands, Ireland, are all struggling with incredibly high rates of loneliness in the double digits. Now, for context, keep in mind that 20% of adults struggling with loneliness in the US means that that's more than the number of people who have diabetes in this country. That's more than the number of people who smoke in this country. And then understand then the consequences of that, because being lonely is not just feeling bad or down on a given day. When you are chronically lonely, it actually has measurable effects on your health. So people who struggle with loneliness, for example, are more likely to die earlier than people who do not. And that mortality impact, the impact on how much shorter your life becomes, when you struggle with loneliness, is equivalent to that of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Wow. It's greater than the impact of obesity. We now know that loneliness increases our risk of heart disease, of depression, of dementia, of anxiety. So this is not just a bad feeling to be passed over or glossed over. It's something to be taken seriously because it's affecting a large portion of our population, and it has profound consequences for our health.
And the public doesn't get that yet. The public doesn't really fully, what you're talking about, that's a pretty profound concept there. But the average person out there doesn't understand yet the implications of the loneliness factor. Would you agree? Or do you think
I would agree.
Increasingly people are starting?
Well, I think increasingly people are hearing about loneliness, but there are a couple things going on. Number one, not enough people actually understand the full impact of it. They may have heard that loneliness is an issue. They don't understand just how profound an issue it is and the impact. But here's the other issue, is that many people, because of this stigma around loneliness, don't feel comfortable talking about it or admitting it. So they struggle with loneliness and think that they're the only ones because no one's talking about it around them. Now, I found this all the time when I was serving as Surgeon General and visiting communities. No one would ever come up to me and say, "Hi, I'm Jane Doe, I'm struggling with loneliness. Hi, I'm John, I'm lonely." They would talk about other issues, but often when I would surface the concept of loneliness, when I would just say, "Hey, I've been hearing more about loneliness in communities. This is a problem that we've struggled with as a country. I myself personally have struggled with loneliness as a child and often as an adult, including during my time in office when I was Surgeon General." Then all of a sudden I would find that stories would start to come out. Yeah. And everyone had a story about themselves or about someone they loved. I remember being at a conference just a few blocks away from here once, and in a 1 hour fireside chat just like this, right, I spoke about loneliness for maybe 2 minutes, that's it. But it's all people wanted to talk about afterward. And there was one woman in particular who came up to me at the end and she said, "I want to thank you for mentioning loneliness and sharing your own personal story because my husband has really struggled with loneliness and he doesn't really know how to talk about it." And she moved aside just a few inches and there I saw behind her was actually her husband and he had tears streaming down his face. And she was speaking because he just couldn't talk. He was that deeply affected by the fact that maybe he wasn't broken because he was lonely. Maybe he wasn't the only one who was struggling with loneliness. It gave him some hope to know that this is a problem that affected other people, but that maybe there was a way forward.
So let's talk about it in the context of technology. I'm looking at our good friend Roger McNamee over here, who just wrote a great book, Zucked, about Facebook and about Mark and what it made me think about how when I was first doing the research for Talking Back to Facebook, the whole theory behind Facebook and the social media platforms, we were connect the world, it was going to make everybody connected. And it was all about sort of the antithesis of what you're saying, Vivek. But so how much has actually, again, the FB, I love Ed's comment about the FB, but the truth is, how much of the social media platforms and sort of the broader internet culture contribute, are they big factors in this, or there are other social phenomena you think that are as or more important in developing all this?
Yeah, well, so
obviously they didn't plan it. This was not the point when they were launching those companies.
Yeah, so look, I think that there are actually a number of factors that are contributing to increasing the loneliness challenge that we feel in the world. And some of it has to do with our culture shifting and with mobility. So for example, people are more likely to leave communities they grew up in and to move multiple times sometimes, leaving good friends and family members behind, often for the purpose of a new job or a new opportunity. But we also know that from a cultural perspective that we actually don't make it easy to talk about emotions. We don't value emotions in the same way. I was at a talk in Philadelphia with a group in a room with 500 people, and I asked them, how many people here look at emotions as a sign of strength as opposed to weakness? And about 499 people raised their hand saying they thought of emotions as a sign of weakness. In that weakness, and only one person rose their hand saying it was a sign of strength. That one person was me. But the point is that in a world where we look at emotions as a liability, we haven't allowed ourselves to have the forums to talk about the emotions we're experiencing, but also how to build emotional resilience and emotional fitness so that we can use what I believe is one of the most powerful sources of fuel that we have, which is our emotions, to power our family life, our personal relationships, our work, and how we show up in our communities. But listen, technology also has a role here in addition to culture and the increases in mobility. Because the promise of technology to connect us is, I think, a partially fulfilled one. Because there are some great aspects of technology. Growing up, I could not interface with my grandparents in India because we didn't have FaceTime, we didn't have email, we didn't have easy ways to communicate with them. My children now, my 2.5-year-old and my 14-month-year-old, would not be able to interact with their great-grandmother nearly as often if they didn't have video conferencing technology. I would not have been able to find some amazing friends from high school if it had not been for social media platforms. There are some amazing uses of technology that do help us connect. But there are also ways in which technology can actually reduce the quality of our connections. And this is one of the key elements around tech, is that tech in many ways as it's currently developed, particularly social media platforms, have been designed to augment the quantity of our connections, but not necessarily the quality of our connections. And they augment the quantity often at the expense of the quality. And so what we find is that there are so many people in our country right now who have thousands of friends on Facebook, who have thousands of followers on Twitter, who live in densely populated cities and in large condo buildings with like hundreds of units, but they feel profoundly alone each and every day. And so I think the real question here is, how do we build and curate and design technology that optimizes the quality of our connections? And sometimes that means not just optimizing the quality of our connections online, but actually enabling our offline connections as well. One of the most powerful uses of social media when it, in terms of connecting us in a good way, is when it enables us to find people who we can meet up with in person. You find that old friend who, if I'm coming to DC for a conference and I post on Twitter or on my Facebook feed, hey, I'm coming to DC, are any friends around for lunch? And we meet up for lunch. That's a very powerful way that it can connect us. But when we use this passively, when we say, I'm alone on a Friday night, let me surf my feed and just see what my friends are up to because I'll feel connected to them. The data clearly shows that actually leads us to feel more disconnected, more depressed, and more anxious.
And have you had conversations when you were, when you were Surgeon General of the United States, and B, subsequently, have you had conversations with some of the major tech leaders about this, the people who are designing the platforms, and framed it as sort of a public health, mental health issue? Have you done that yet?
It's a great, interesting question. I was starting to get really interested in this toward the latter half of my time in government, and we were actually just building, a campaign around emotional health and well-being, which was going to target, and in particular, the influence of technology. And for various reasons, we didn't get to actually do that. Because our time in office was cut short a bit. But that's an issue which I still feel very passionately about. It's actually why I'm writing this book and looking to build a larger movement and be a part of a larger movement that can help to engage with tech leaders and asking the deeper question of what is our responsibility to society. It is no longer morally acceptable for technology companies to say, we just create the platforms. How people use them is up to them.
Correct.
That is morally indefensible. It is a cop-out, and it is hurting children and adults and society at large.
I agree.
What we have to do is ask ourselves what the impact of our products and services are on the people that we are seeking to serve. And we have to take some measure of responsibility for this. And part of that involves, number one, understanding that impact and investing in understanding that impact. But two, it involves the courage to actually take action when we see that there may be negative consequences, even if that impacts our profits. There's an important principle here, which is that we cannot allow companies, whether it's technology companies or other companies, we cannot allow governments, we cannot allow anyone to ultimately place profits over people. We have to function with an ethic that tells us that people and their well-being comes first. That does not mean that profit doesn't matter. It does not mean that profit is a bad thing. But it means that in the order of priority, that all our companies should be looking to serve people and then make a profit and not the other way around.
Well, we are as I said at the beginning, this is a watershed moment for this conversation with society, but for the tech companies. Our strategy has been sort of twofold. On the one hand, work with companies. By the way, obviously Commons is not anti-media, anti-tech. We have 110, 120 million unique users who come and we tell them where to go find all the good stuff. So, but having said it, in the context of a Washington discussion right after Ed Markey introduced the new Kids Act, which is obviously designed to address some of these issues. My question would be this, Vivek. One, we can work as we did with Apple, and Google took the term digital well-being, and now Apple created screen time last year. We worked closely with them doing that. Google took the term digital well-being, and it's now their version of screen time on Android devices. So to me, that's a really good example of how to work in a positive way with the industry. But at the same time, our sense is that the industry has yet to really step up to the plate and be held accountable for what they've done, and have only begun to even acknowledge some of the issues that you're mentioning. So my question to you would be, how do you see the next couple of years in terms of the way we ought to treat the tech industry around this? Again, making the point that the tech industry is not monolithic. We found that out when we wrote and passed the privacy law in California last year. We didn't just deal with trade association lobbyists. We went to the CEOs of the major companies and split them and said, what do you think about privacy? Yes or no, basically. So my question to you is, as you look out, Vivek, over the next couple of years, where hopefully a sea change will happen that will address some of the mental health and loneliness issues that you're talking and writing about, how would you sort of do the approach? How do you think would be most effective to see change? Between regulation, hammering the tech companies, encouraging the tech companies, educating the public? How do you see sort of the broader solution?
Yeah, so I think there are a few things that have to happen in parallel. Number one, from a public awareness perspective, we need to continue to ensure that the public is aware of the impact that technology is having on their children and more broadly on all of us. And that includes a positive and negative impact, because we're not trying to roll back time here and go back to a pre-tech era. Technology is amazing, and I say that as somebody who uses technology, who spent 7 years building a technology company, and that I'm proud of, who believes that there's a lot of uses for tech in the future. But we need to help ensure that the public is sufficiently aware and invested in the decision in this larger fight that's going to happen. The second thing that we have to do is from a government perspective, we have to invest sufficiently in research to understand the full impact, because the truth is, as much data as we have, we need a lot more to fully understand, especially longitudinal data, to fully understand the true impact that technology is having on different facets of our life. Now,
that's the camera story, this act that Senator Markey was just talking about.
Exactly. It's something that I was very glad to hear Senator Markey talking about this initiative, because that's actually really important. And as part of that research, we have to ask the right questions as well. When Mark Zuckerberg was called to Capitol Hill, to testify some months ago, and he was grilled by senators and members of Congress, most of the questions were about how Facebook is impacting security and information. There were very few, if any, questions about how Facebook is affecting our relationships with each other.
Right.
But that is one of the most important sources of capital that we have, our social capital. And it is, in fact, being adversely affected by tech. So government can play a role by investing in research, by setting standards, and by convening the right players to have a conversation, placing this high on our national agenda. And finally, there's the industry itself. And I actually am a strong believer that we should be seeking to partner and work closely with industry wherever possible. There are a lot of good actors and good players in industry who want to be a part of the solution. Some of the companies that we worry about have many great people within them who are there because they actually believe that they can do some good. And so the question is, how do we engage and harness the power of these companies while also not being naive about the fact that there's often a profit motive that can be driving these companies and making the right decision difficult, which means that from a government perspective, having accountability standards baked into legislation and doing that in a transparent way so that consumers understand where companies are falling in terms of their responsibilities and performance, this is incredibly important. There's one thing I'd actually love to read to you that for me really captured in many ways, the challenge that we're facing with technology in terms of the impact on our children. The tech, again, is a broad thing. We're talking about everything from streaming video to social media to just the constant availability of our phones. We're talking about apps that allow you to doctor your image, and post who you think you should be online instead of what you actually naturally look like. We're talking about all of this together. And my concern, as a father of young children, has been what kind of world are our children going to actually grow up in? Yeah. Will they feel comfortable being themselves? Will they grow up in a world that supports them and encourages them to be authentic? Will they be ridiculed when they take a risk by asking someone out on a date or expressing interest in someone's idea or asking somebody to have lunch? And so there's this quote that I came across just recently from a young person who actually was interviewed by Catherine Steyer, who's written a beautiful book actually on topics related to this, but particularly on camping, actually on the impact that camps can have, especially tech-free camps on our kids. And one of the children she interviewed said this. She said, "It is so ironic. We're the most connected generation in history, but we suck at falling in love. We don't know how to flirt. We get drunk and hook up. And we don't even meet up before that. You text someone at 2:15 a.m. and say, 'Hey, what's up?' Everyone knows it's a booty call. You don't even go out for a drink. And the really sad thing is we don't know how to be vulnerable. We don't know how to pick up the phone and say, 'Hey, I really like you. Hey, I'm feeling sad. Hey, would you like to go out on a date?'" This is not an isolated story, but when I talk to parents and children, these are the consequences of the current environment in which we're living in, where children are more connected to people than ever before, but where they feel more alone, more isolated than ever before, where they don't feel the permission to be authentically who they are. One of the colleagues I work with on this, in terms of doing some research for this book, recently graduated from college, and she told me that for her, many nights freshman year were spent, especially Friday nights, were spent alone in bed with some snacks, watching reruns on Netflix, and occasionally FaceTiming with her mother to tell her how sad she was, and then ultimately crying herself to sleep. It pains me to see this happening so often to many of our students, to many of our young people. And I was actually doing a radio interview with the Iowa NPR station. And my favorite part of doing radio interviews is when people call in toward the end. A woman called in and she said to me, she was almost in tears, and she said, I sent my daughter off to college, and I was so excited, about the community she was going to engage in, this whole new world that was opening up for her. It's full of possibility. And she just came back for a holiday break. And she said to me, "Mom, we text each other all the time, everyone's around each other. There are people around me all the time, but nobody really knows who I am. Nobody even asks really, who I am and wants to know anything real about me. And I just feel so alone." And this mother was in tears because she was saying, I sent my daughter to college thinking she would be a part of the community. And instead she's come away feeling incredibly isolated. This is actually what's at stake. It's that from the youngest of ages, we are eroding the foundation that our children need to build healthy and fulfilling lives. And that foundation will take decades to rebuild, if at all. And I don't think we are aware fully of the costs of this when we are making decisions about technology. I don't think most members of Congress actually fully understand the profound impact that this is having on our children, for the future. And this is where building the public awareness is so important, because if the public knows and is engaged and committed to addressing these issues, we can push Congress, we can push local legislators, we can push technology companies and hold them accountable. And we can ultimately change our culture around this as well. Because make no mistake, as much as we can legislate around these issues, as much as tech companies can make the right decisions, what matters also is what is important to us. And what has become clear to me in doing research for this book is that we have built a society that is centered around work, around achievement, around money. And we fit people and relationships in where it's convenient. When you tell people, "Hey, I'm moving to town X because I got a new job there," nobody bats an eyelid. They say, "That's amazing." If you tell people, "I'm moving back to a really small town where the job prospects are minimal, and I don't, I'm not going to have like a great standard of living, but my family's there, and I've got some friends from growing up, people sometimes will give you a bit of a funny look. We have built a society that is centered around work, achievement, and money. And the question that I wonder about more and more these days is how do we rebuild a society that's centered around people, that recognizes that our connection with other people is the greatest resource that we have. It's the foundation on which we build everything else. And when that foundation is shaky, then everything else we build, whether it's an amazing job, a phenomenal reputation, a big house, all of that ends up not feeling nearly as meaningful. So that's what's at stake. Wow. And we have to shape our culture toward a people-centered culture that's reflected in the decisions we make in our lives each and every day, but that's also reflected in our policy and in the companies in our country.
Wow, Vivek, that was actually really well said. I'm serious. That was great. You know, speaking of audience questions, we want to spend a little time go to the audience. That was really, 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 really articulate and thoughtful. But when you read that quote, I thought of my 3 older kids who were in college. Also, I'm a Stanford professor. I ask the kids about this all the time now, because there was such a what's so interesting, the kids started with the word irony. The irony is, because the irony of all this was, when the platforms were built, the whole idea was to connect everybody and to make the world one big global village, and we were all going to sing Kumbaya together and get to know each other better. And the reality has been almost precisely the opposite in many cases. So it's so fascinating, but I have not heard anyone say it more thoughtfully than you have. Okay, so do I just read from the questions, or can I just call on people too? Okay, does anybody want to ask a question over in the audience? Okay, we'll start over with you, because I've got a couple good ones.
Good morning. So I was thinking of, I'm in K-12 education. I work for DC Public Schools.
Yeah,
so
what's your name? You should tell everybody.
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Rajani Galloway. I'm the manager of library programs for DC Public Schools, and
Great.
We're about to start a one-to-one initiative in grades 3, 6, and 9. So I'm thinking about, in education preparation, it's always an emphasis on on IQ, but I'm thinking about emotional intelligence and how professional development and training for educators, whether it's media specialists or teachers, can be more indicative of what you're referencing as far as the SEL component, the tech, and being holistic in approach. So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, Reggie, thank you so much for that question. You rightly pointed out that schools are a place where we need to think about how to build this foundation for strong social connections. You know, what's really interesting is that in 2016, when I was in office, I had published the first Surgeon General's report on substance use and addiction. It was our report on alcohol, drugs, and health. And we dedicated an entire chapter of that to prevention. And we did this knowing that we were in the midst of an opioid crisis, but we also had problems with alcohol that, in fact, far outstripped our challenges with opioids in terms of costing us more lives and money, even though it almost feels like we moved on from thinking that alcohol is a big problem in our society. It still is. But the interesting thing about this prevention chapter is the programs that we profiled were not programs that were hitting kids over the head in school and saying drugs are bad, alcohol is bad, everything is bad. These were actually programs that strengthened often children's emotional well-being and their skills for building connection with each other. And what was interesting is that when you do that for children, you not only impact their likelihood of developing a substance use disorder, in fact, you dramatically lower it, but you reduce their likelihood of smoking in the future, you reduce the likelihood of teens getting pregnant, you increase graduation rates and grades, you reduce behavioral disturbances and criminal justice engagement. It's extraordinary what happens when you strengthen the foundation for children when it comes to their emotional well-being and their relationships. Now, there are programs that have developed and I've seen implemented in schools around the country which are making headway on giving kids the tools they need for a healthy emotional life. The Ruler program is one of these, which was developed at Yale, but is now being used in over 1,600 schools in the United States and around the world. But here's the important question, which is how do we make emotional well-being and the cultivation of social emotional learning a priority in our schools, without overloading teachers who are already overburdened, without taxing budgets that are already thin. And it comes down to, this is not just legislation and not just funding, both of which are critically important, but it also comes to cultivating public awareness around the importance of this. Because I'll tell you, when parents and by extension school boards come to understand that something is important, they can often move and take action in powerful ways on it. But if you tell people that they're going to, hey, we want to invest in this emotional well-being program, and their understanding is that what's really important is that my kids learn math and English, and that they learn science, and they learn how to score high on the standardized tests so that they can get into, a college. And if that's their understanding, then they're going to think that this is a waste of time, right? That was actually what I encountered in California when I went into some programs there that had implemented some extraordinary well-being programs that was having dramatic effects on the grades of children and dramatic reductions of behavioral disturbances. Initially, the parents were like, well, what is all this voodoo stuff that you're trying to bring into our school? But then they started showing them the data on how the kids who participated did dramatically better. And they actually behaved better at school, at home as well. And then, amazingly, the teachers sort of bought in. Yeah, I mean, the parents bought into it. So I think we have to, this is not the hardest part of this work, is actually mobilizing communities and informing and educating communities. That's the hard part of grassroots organizing. But make no mistake, our mission to make and create a more connected world, to invest in emotional health and well-being, to make technology a tool that helps build us up instead of a tool that tears us down. This is a movement that we have to build in this country that has to be built door by door, community by community, person by person. And that's hard, it takes time, but it requires passionate and committed soldiers. And that's why I'm so excited to see so many people here in the room today and participating by live stream, because we need a lot of help to build public momentum around these issues.
So well said, Vivek. And we have this common sense built the field of digital citizenship, right? Digital literacy. As Elizabeth said, 70,000 plus schools now member. We're rolling out the 2.0 version of the curriculum that we did with Howard Gardner and all his colleagues at the Harvard Ed School. It's much more about social emotional learning, particularly for the middle school and high school kids now. And it's actually a scaled effort to build public awareness on that level. We should hire you to advertise this all over the world. Okay, one more or two more questions. How many more do we have? Two or three? Good. Okay. Please tell who you are and then
Sure, my name is Colleen Creighton. I'm the Executive Director of the American Association of Suicidology. So I wanted to hear from you.
Suicidology? Okay.
Which is a thing.
Okay.
But I want to hear kind of that connection, because if you look at the theory of suicide, there's the thwarted belongingness section of it, which seems like that would be directly related to loneliness. So my question is, too, with tech, we came up against Facebook and Instagram, and we're having an internal debate, too, with their new policy of taking down anything self-harm related. What we found is, while on one lens that looks great, and it's a great way to protect kids, on the other side, we're hearing from attempt survivors that really use those self-harm imagery to say that's a sense of hope and healing. So we're trying to kind of find that happy divide between the two, if there is one, and basically why, with 47,000 lives lost each year to suicide, why is no one even talking about the issue?
It's such a great question, and thank you for raising this, because it's so disturbing to see our suicide rates going up in this country. It's extraordinarily disturbing to see self-harm rates going up among children, which is something we talk about even far less than suicide. And I think it does beg us asking the deeper question of what is going on. This is in the wealthiest country in the world, where we have the most resources and most capabilities, the greatest innovation, I believe. Why are we struggling to keep people alive? And I think a lot of this does come back to our disconnection from each other and a lack of belonging. We were not designed to be isolated creatures. We were designed and we evolved to be social creatures. That does not mean that we're designed to be extroverts. But what it does mean is that at some fundamental level, we need each other. And when we are alone, when we do not feel like we have a place and a group of people to whom we belong, then that actually physiologically puts our body in a chronic stress state. And it's actually somewhat easy to understand why, if you think about the evolution of this, which is that thousands of years ago, when we were out as hunters and gatherers, our ability to stay alive was actually predicated on our ability to build trusted relationships with others. If I had a network of people I trusted, we could take turns staying up at night, watching out for predators. We could pool our food and ensure that we had a stable food supply, so that we didn't, alone, that we didn't starve, periodically. So connection was actually, in trusted relationships, were key to our survival, and such that when you were separated from the group, you knew that your survival was at risk. Yeah. And what happened actually in those moments when you're separated is that you entered a state of hypervigilance by necessity, because you wanted to know that even if there was a 1% chance that the twig that broke behind you was a predator, you wanted to interpret it as a threat because that was key to your survival. Now imagine how that plays out in 2019 when people are struggling with loneliness, are into that phase and mindset of hypervigilance, and are perceiving things around them as threats even when they're well-intentioned. That's actually what happens. And so this is why when people struggle with loneliness, sometimes it can seem that they're cantankerous, sometimes it can seem that they're pushing away help when people are offering it, but it has to do with the mindset shift that occurs, when we struggle with loneliness. An irony where our body craves connection, but our mind is actually pushing people away out of fear. And so I think we can't emphasize enough how important it is for us to re-examine the factors that are impacting our connection with each other and our sense of belonging. There are so many people in our country, I've realized, who walk around feeling profoundly alone, like they don't belong, like they're strangers in their own communities. And that has profound implications for how they show up in their communities, whether they volunteer or not, whether they vote or not. It impacts how they parent their children, and it even affects ultimately their will to live. So there are times, when we can take complex problems and assume that they have complex and expensive solutions. But at some basic level, I think that our challenges with suicide, with addiction, with violence in our country can be dramatically improved, not entirely solved, but dramatically improved if we can refocus on how we rebuild our connections with other people and how we ensure that every person in our country feels that they matter, feels like they belong, feels like their life has value. And as obvious as that may seem, there are many people, like the child I quoted today, and many others, who feel that they don't matter.
Correct.
And if they disappeared off the face of their earth, that nobody would miss them. We have to help them understand that that is not the case.
Wow. You just keep making really, really great comments. Honestly, Vivek, this is a really profound discussion. Yeah, back there. Either of you two. You can argue it out with each other who gets to ask the next question.
Hi, my name is Bonnie Brace.
Okay, sure.
And I work with Vice President Gore in the National Information Infrastructure Advisory Council. And what he said, Marky said, made tears. But what I want to say to you is, how do we help those who are with the outer net? They are not really connected, just sort of. We're working with groups of people who get a little bit of the internet, and what they get is the gross, sexual. I mean, we have kids in school saying sexual things I've never heard before. I think there's a whole part of it that will be taken care of by that. But in the meantime, what do we do to introduce kids who are sort of using the internet to the most positive things? And I know Common Sense is doing that.
Yeah.
But parents may not know how to access Common Sense and where the things are to help them. I've never heard such cursing. Kids asking me about what is oral sex in school. Hello? Libraries, community centers, and organizations need to help parents, because if you look at the Washingtonian, that story where the teacher said they just had to leave, I have two relatives who left teaching. One, a second grade class ran her out because they were talking all this sexual stuff, and she couldn't handle it. And my sister, who is the same age as me, went back to teaching to help, and what happened to her was a kid tried to hump her, and she couldn't figure out what in the world. So there's something wrong with the way sexuality is being shared. At least that's what I think.
That's a great question. Can I make one
Sure,
quick suggestion,
absolutely.
just on a process point,
Yep.
since we're running out of time? Do you mind if the two folks who have questions, if you just quickly ask your questions, and maybe I can give a
Sure,
combined
that's
answer?
a great idea.
Yeah, my question is, I'm Latrice Rogers, and I'm with Montgomery County Public Schools. And my question is related to the loneliness you spoke about, especially for college students going away for the first time. So I'm wondering, is this conversation, has it risen to a level where colleges are considering how to build in strategically connectedness for students who are arriving on campuses for the first time? Do you know if anybody is really paying attention to that?
Okay, thanks.
Good morning. My name is Dawn Berkeley. I'm the coordinator of educational technology at St. Albans School. And my question is semi-related. So I'm thinking about the other end of the spectrum. In particular, what happens to aging populations? I'm growing more concerned about the connectedness and lack thereof between the generations and teenagers, obviously, and how there's that disconnect between that and the elderly and what you're saying globally. I feel that we in the Western world, the respect and honor that should probably be given to that population is somewhat missing and degraded because of technology in some ways.
Okay, you got to answer all
Okay.
that in 1 minute.
All right. So
Those were really good questions.
these are great questions. And I couldn't agree with you more that we have to support parents in how to
Yeah.
guide their children in not just being exposed to the right things, but how to manage things when they're exposed to the wrong things, because that often lands on a parent's doorstep. And the truth is, most of our parents are not equipped to do this, right? No one helped them figure out how to engage with technology in a really healthy way. But I will tell you that from my conversations with parents, they are hungry for this kind of support. And they're also concerned about their children when their children go to college and trying to figure out what happens to them, what is going to, how are they going to be impacted. And I think I have talked to many universities who are increasingly aware of the challenges with loneliness that their students are struggling with. But they're all trying to figure out what the solution is and how best to go about connecting their students. And one thing I will tell you is that what's really critical in doing this is not just to throw happy hours and mixers where kids can get together and just like bump into each other, because random bumping into each other is not the solution to loneliness. The real question is, how do you enable real sharing and conversation? How do you create spaces where both men and women can be vulnerable and honest and authentic in what's happening to them? Because it's in that space of authenticity that the greatest bonds are actually built. And the truth is that creating those spaces is not something that all and most universities have figured out how to actually do. And it requires actually addressing important cultural norms as well, some of which hurt us. So take men, for example. Our norms around masculinity tell us that being a man is about being self-sufficient. It's about not showing emotion. It's about being a rock on an island, right? And if it's permissible to show emotion toward anyone, it's only your romantic partner, and then that's about it. But the truth is that that's not evolutionarily how men were built. They were built to have actually needs similar to women when it comes to relationships. We've, in a bizarre way in society, have put thinking in the province of men and feeling in the province of women. And that's not the case. Men and women both need to think and feel and are capable of thinking and feeling. And when we ignore one dimension of their lives, then it harms them. And so a question that's incumbent, I think, about universities is, since they're taking in young people at a formative time in their life, is how do they help to reset those norms that tell us that not only is it okay to be vulnerable, but it's actually the source of strength for us. And not only are emotions a natural part of who we are, but they can be our greatest fuel if we harness them properly. And I think that the elderly can actually be a huge force in helping us to do this. One of the most inspiring things to me has been seeing these intergenerational programs, whether it's around walking or school programs like in Baltimore, where like Experience Corps, where they brought elderly into schools to help tutor and mentor young people, just as the young people are helping to train them on technology and expose them to the world. These kind of mutual connections are amazing. In the UK, they have housing projects where college students can actually choose to live with a senior citizen who has a large house and might be all alone and can use a company, and the college student could use some place to stay that's free or has low rent. And the relationships that are built there have turned out to be quite amazing. So the amazing thing about this, in summary for me, is as difficult as the numbers may seem, as profound as the consequences of loneliness may be, as harmful at times as our technology may be in terms of reducing the quality of our relationships, I'm ultimately optimistic because I think that the quest to build a more connected world is not an effort to make us someone who we're not. It's actually an effort to bring us back to who we deeply are, fundamentally, which is beings that think and feel, beings that rely on and need each other, and that are driven and fueled by emotion. That's who we are. And so this is a quest to return to our roots in many ways. But it's also one where the most powerful forces in helping us build a more connected world are not in the halls of Congress or in the corridors of companies, but they're actually in the homes of people all across America. Because each of us, has the ability to address loneliness by the choices we make and who we reach out to in our lives, by how we choose to prioritize people, and by how we choose to model behavior for our children. And I'm painfully aware, having these two small children who are attracted like glue to our phones, I'm painfully aware that they are picking up on all of our cues as well. And that when I feel a text message vibrate and take my phone out, at a time where I'm supposed to be playing with my child is noticing that and looking at that. So part of my power is in what I model to my children. So we have the power to create a more connected world based on the decisions we make. We have the power to shape the culture that determines how connected or not connected we are. And we have the power to build a movement that can shape legislation and influence what companies ultimately do. This is the time to do it. Ideally, we would have done this 10, 15, 20 years ago. I'm grateful that there are organizations like Common Sense that are helping to fuel and accelerate this movement. But make no mistake that the defining question, I believe, of our time is what are we doing to create greater connection between people? Because that ultimately is the foundation, I believe, on which we build everything else.
Boy, I'm going to end it right there.